are here. Thank you. I don't think I know one person in the audience. Is Corinne Glesney here? Does anyone know Corinne Glesney? She's my Asheville friend. She's coming later. Hello. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really just so honored. I mean, I really feel like, you know, when Wild came out, I thought like 5 people would read it. So thank you for coming here to hear me talk, and thank you for Malaprops, this beautiful bookstore, supporting my writing. I'm really, you know, I appreciate it so much. I'm going to talk to you tonight about both books. It's really rare that a writer has 2 books come out in the span of 4 months. It kind of happened by accident. I wrote Wild on purpose, and then I wrote Tiny Beautiful Things really, truly by accident. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. People in the back too? So Wild, as you know, how many of you have read Wild? Okay. So, and how many of you came to me through the Dear Sugar column first? Okay, there's a little mix, but it's more Wild folks. So what happened is I was writing Wild. I started writing Wild in 2008. And for those of you who haven't read it or heard about it, it's, as the hiking boot suggests, it is the chronicle of my 1,100-mile hike on the Pacific Crest Trail in the summer of 1995 when I was 26. And it's really about that hike. It's about everything that brought me out there too. I've received countless emails from people, backpackers and hikers, who bought the book because they thought they were going to get a book about backpacking and hiking. And they got a lot more than that. It really is, I mean, there is that backpacking and hiking piece, right? But it's also really that emotional journey of why I found myself standing in line at an REI one winter day and outside of Minneapolis. There had been a blizzard and I needed to buy a shovel. And the beauty of writing memoir or personal work, such as I do, drawing on your life, is that so often, really, life offers us up those metaphors that you'd have to invent in fiction. And so it was no coincidence that at that moment that I literally needed to dig myself out. I was standing there waiting to do that, to buy that shovel. That I saw this book called The Pacific Crest Trail, Volume 1, California. I'd never heard of the Pacific Crest Trail until that moment. I had never gone backpacking before. And I picked it up just to kill time, because I was waiting in line. And I read the back of the book, and it told, in a couple of paragraphs, essentially the story of what the PCT is. How many of you had heard of the PCT before Wild? How many of you had not? Okay, and I know the Appalachian Trail is in your backyard here, right, or your front yard. So I read about this National Scenic Trail that is the cousin to the Appalachian Trail, that goes from Mexico to Canada through California, Oregon, and Washington. And it just seemed so magnificent and grand and important and beautiful and big. And I knew at that moment that I was absolutely none of those things, and that I needed to attach myself to something that was, so that I could, I guess, pull myself out of this place I was in my life at that moment, which is really, for sure, very much at the bottom. What had happened about 3.5 years before I laid hands on that book is that my mother had died of cancer very suddenly at the age of 45. And her death essentially split my life in two. It was the end of the world as I knew it, and the beginning of another world. And I had to figure out who I was in that other world. You know, really at a time in my life that we all have to figure that out to some extent in our 20s when we're trying to figure out who we are. And I had to do that really while having lost this one person in my life who had loved me really unconditionally and truly. And so I did that gracefully and with great strength. And I also did that very, very clunkily and very, in ways that were very destructive and ugly. And it was there, it was in the downswing of that moment that I really just reached out for that branch of the PCT. And so what I did is I was a waitress at the time and an aspiring writer, and every week I would just save my money. And I had that one guidebook, that Pacific Crest Trail Volume 1, California, and it became my Bible. And I just read it over and over again, and then each week I would go to REI and and buy whatever they told me to buy, which is a rather lot of stuff. Does anyone in here work at REI? I love you guys, you know. REI has been very good to me, but one of the things they did, it's kind of like when I was pregnant with my first child, my husband and I were really panicked because here we were on the verge of having a baby and we had absolutely no idea what to do with the baby. And so we thought, well, we'll just buy a lot of stuff associated with the baby. You know, because we're so American, you know, I buy, therefore I am. So we went to the Babies R Us, which is, you know, totally antithetical to everything we believe in and stand for. And so we get in there and it's like, you know, it's a city block full of things for the baby. And we just like walk up and down the aisles and we buy like basically one thing from every aisle. Like whatever category, we just bought one of those things. And I sort of went about that same method when it came to backpacking. So I found myself on the first day of my hike. I sold all my things, I divorced my husband, I did all these things to sort of close my life down. Yeah, just threw that in there, my ex-husband. And I drove to the town of Mojave, California, and the first morning of my hike, I realized that I had never packed my pack before, which, you know, those of you who've read Wild, you know, this is not a how-to guide. This is like a what not to do. And so the people at REI said, you should take a trial run, but I just didn't for whatever reason. And on that first morning, I loaded all this stuff onto the bed and then tried to get it all in my pack, and it didn't fit. And then I remember that I was speaking in the Mojave Desert, where it turns out there's no water. And I had to carry this huge, huge dromedary bag of water, like 24.5 pounds to be exact. And what I found when I got everything ready to go on the pack is that I couldn't lift the pack. And not even just like a teeny bit. You know, there's a difference between something you can kind of hoist and then something you absolutely cannot budge, and that was how heavy my pack was. People are always asking me how heavy my pack was. And it's like whatever weight it is that I absolutely cannot lift. Which is, it's sort of, as I say, well, it's sort of equivalent of roughly about the weight of like a Volkswagen Beetle, you know, so, and right there, when I was writing that scene, really writing that just the physicality of what actually happened on that first day, what I realized is that in that moment it's really what Wild is about. It's about how I lifted that weight in literal ways over those 1,100 miles on my hike, how I managed to get it on my body and carry it, but also how I managed to bear what felt unbearable to me on the inside too. That world without my mom, that world with me in it, the me in it who had made mistakes and done things I regretted. And so that's the journey that I went on in Wild, in the walk itself, and then also again in the book, when I years later decided to tell the story of that hike and really come to grips with what it meant to me in my life. I learned a lot of stuff. I had done, you know, I said I'd never gone backpacking before, but I went out there really feeling like I was sort of prepared because I'd done a lot of hiking. And I mean, I was an avid hiker, but I was a day hiker. And I sort of conceived of this backpacking trip of just like a bunch of day hikes kind of glommed together. And it's not that at all. You know, like, you know, picnics, and you know, at the end of the day, you have a glass of Chardonnay and a burger. You know, you get in the car and drive home. You know, but no, instead you're out there and you're carrying everything you need. And what happened is I got out there and it was much, much, much more remote than I imagined it could be. The first 8 days of my hike, I didn't even see another human being. And I could have gone home on day 9 and had a profound experience. Just those 8 days, walking through the wilderness with a pack that was causing me great agony. And when I was about 11 days out, I met the first backpacker on the trail, this man named Greg, who told me, I mean, essentially he knew what he was doing. And so when I saw him, I recognized, I mean, I knew that something was kind of going wrong. I sort of suspected that, you know, maybe this wasn't how it should be. But when I met him, it was very, very clear that I was, as I say in the book, a big fat idiot. And he said to me a number of things, but one thing he said is, we are hiking the Pacific Crest Trail in the wrong year. Because the year we were out there had been just this absolute record snowpack. So it had snowed like 3 times the amount that, in the history of snow that it had ever snowed, And so the Pacific Crest Trail was completely buried for about 500 miles. And so we had to do these bypasses. Most people who hiked the Pacific Crest Trail that year had to get off and do these, hitchhike on roads around the trail and then reconnect with the trail at slightly lower elevations to try to escape those miles and miles of snow. So that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm doing in this passage that I thought I'd read to you. I did learn things the hard way, but pretty quickly. And when you learn things the hard way, you do tend to learn them rather fast. So by the time I'm out there in this passage, I've been out a month, and I kind of am a seasoned backpacker at this point. And I've lightened my load a little bit. I still have an incredibly heavy pack. And so I gave my pack a nickname. It's called Monster, and it earned it, absolutely. And another thing you should know is that I didn't have a gun. Every time I met somebody who was not a backpacker, who was just like a civilian, especially men, they would say, I hope you have a gun. I did not have a gun, but I did have a whistle. And it wasn't just any old whistle. It was the world's loudest whistle. I know because the packaging said so. And it was rather loud, I will say that. So I'm standing by the side of the road outside this town of Chester, California, Northern California. And this man pulls over. And a lot of times when I hitchhiked, I get rides pretty quickly. Do you guys around here, do the AT people hitchhike with their backpacks? See, and so you pick them up, that they're not serial killers. But, for me, because there were so few people really hiking the PCT, especially in '95, but even now, so many more people hike the AT. A lot of times when I'd be hitchhiking, most of the people I met had never heard of the PCT. They just thought I was a hitchhiker, as you'll see in this scene. So this guy pulls over, and instead of just rolling down his window, he gets out of the car and he starts walking toward me along the side of the road, which is alarming to me. And I tried to quickly assess, because we know that these things can be assessed, whether he was a serial killer or not. And because we can always tell them right off the bat, right? And I saw that on the bumper of his car, he had a bumper sticker that said, "Imagine world peace." Which was deeply reassuring to me. Because I don't know much about serial killers, but I do know that none of them have ever imagined world peace, probably ever. So I felt reassured that he was like one of my people. And he was about my age, and he introduces himself. He tells me his name is Jimmy Carter, and he can't give me a ride, because there's absolutely no room in his car, it's jam-packed. But instead he stopped because he wants to talk to me, he wants to interview me. He's a reporter for a publication called the Hobo Times. So, I tell him I'm not a hobo. I say I'm a long distance hiker, and I basically try to shoo him away, because with him there, that's the other thing. Anytime I was anywhere near a man, nobody would ever stop and pick me up. So I'm trying to get rid of him so people will stop and give me a ride, but he persists. He doesn't understand the Pacific Crest Trail or what I'm talking about, and so he continually presses me and tries to interview me. So I say to him, I explain it's a national scenic trail, I offered, but he only continued looking at me with a patient expression on his face, his unmarked notebook in his hand. As I explained to him what the PCT was and what I was doing on it, I saw that Jimmy Carter wasn't bad looking. I wondered if he had any food in his car. So if you're hiking a wilderness trail, what are you doing here, he asked. I told him about bypassing the deep snow in Lassen Volcanic National Park. I added, I'd been on the trail about a month. And how many times have you slept with a roof over your head in that month, he asked. 3 times, I answered. Is this all you have? He nodded to my backpack and ski pole. Yeah, I have some things in storage too, but for now this is it. I put my hand on Monster. It felt like a friend always, but even more so in the company of Jimmy Carter. Well then, I'd say you're a hobo, he said happily. And asked me to spell my first and last names. I did, and then wished I hadn't. No way, he exclaimed when he had it all down on the page. Is that really your name? Yeah, I said, and turned away as if searching for a car so he wouldn't read the hesitation on my face. So, Jimmy Carter said, we could say you're an actual stray. I wouldn't say that, I stammered. Being a hobo and being a hiker are two different things, you know. I looped my wrist into the pink strap of my ski pole and scraped the dirt with the tip, making a line that went nowhere. I'm not a hiker in the way you might think of a hiker, I explained. I'm more like an expert hiker. I hike 20 miles a day after day, up and down mountains, far away from roads or people or anything, often going days without seeing another person. Maybe you should do a story on that instead. He glanced up at me from his notebook, his hair blowing extravagantly across his pale face. He seemed like so many people I knew. I wondered if I seemed that way to him. I hardly ever meet hobo women, he half whispered. So this is fucking cool. I am not a hobo, I insisted this time. Hobo women are hard to find, he persisted. I told him that this was because women were too oppressed to be hobos. That most likely all the women who wanted to be hobos were holed up in some house with a gaggle of children to raise. Children who'd been fathered by hobo men who'd hit the road. I see, he said. You're a feminist then. Yes, I said. It felt good to agree on something. I'd like to get a picture of you, Jimmy Carter said. He reached into his car and pulled out a camera, smiled as he snapped a shot. He told me to look for his piece on me in the fall issue of the Hobo Times, as if I were a regular reader. Articles have been excerpted in Harper's, he added. Harper's? I asked, dumbfounded. Yeah, it's this magazine that, I know what Harper's is. And I don't want to be in Harper's, or rather, I really want to be in Harper's. But not because I'm a hobo. I thought you weren't, he said, and turned to open the trunk of his car. Well, I'm not. So it would be a really bad idea to be in Harper's, which means you probably shouldn't even write the article, because standard issue hobo care package, he said, turning to give me a can of cold Budweiser beer and a plastic grocery bag with a handful of items at its bottom. But I'm not a hobo, I echoed for the last time with less fervor, afraid he'd finally believe me and take the standard issue hobo care package away. Thanks for the interview, he said, and shut the trunk. Stay safe out here. Yeah, you too, I said. You have a gun, I assume. At least I hope you do. I shrugged, unwilling to commit either way. Because I know you've been south of here, but now you're going north, which means you're soon entering Bigfoot country. Bigfoot? Yeah, you know, Sasquatch, no lie. From here all the way up to the border and into Oregon, you're in the territory where most of the Bigfoot sightings in the world are reported. He turned to the trees as if one might come barreling out at us. A lot of folks believe in them. A lot of hobo folks. Folks who are out here, folks who know. I hear Bigfoot stories all the time. Well, I'm okay, I think, at least so far, I said and laughed, though my stomach did a little somersault. In the weeks preceding my hike on the PCT, when I decided not to be afraid of anything, I'd been thinking about bears and snakes and mountain lions and strange people I met along the way. I hadn't pondered hairy humanoid bipedal beasts. But you're probably fine, I wouldn't worry. Chances are they'll leave you alone, especially if you have a gun. Right, I said. Good luck on your hike, he said and got in his car. Good luck finding hobos, I said and waved as he drove away. I stood there for a while, letting cars pass without even trying to get them to give me a ride. I felt more alone than anyone in the whole wide world. The sun beat down on me hot, even through my hat. I jabbed my thumb at a car and realized only after it passed that it didn't look so good I was holding a beer. These are great. I pressed its cool aluminum against my hot forehead and suddenly had the urge to drink it. Why shouldn't I? It would only get warm in my pack. I hoisted Monster onto my back and ambled through the weeds down into the ditch and then up again into the woods, which somehow felt like home to me. Like the world that was mine in a way that the world of roads and towns and cars was no longer. I walked until I found a good spot in the shade. Then I sat down in the dirt and cracked the beer open. I didn't like beer. In fact, that Budweiser was the first whole beer I'd ever drunk in my life. But it tasted good to me, like beer tastes, I imagine, to those who love it, cold and sharp and crisp and right. While I drank it, I explored the contents of the plastic grocery bag. I took everything out and laid each item before me on the ground. A pack of peppermint gum, 3 individually wrapped wet wipes, a paper packet containing 2 aspirin, 6 butterscotch candies in translucent gold wrappers, a book of matches that said, "Thank you, Steinbeck drug," a Slim Jim sausage sealed in its plastic vacuum world, a single cigarette in a cylindrical faux glass case, a disposable razor, and a short, fat can of baked beans. I ate the Slim Jim first, washing it down with the last of my bud, and then the butterscotch candies, all 6 of them, one after the other. And then, still hungry, always hungry, turned my attention to the can of baked beans. I pried it open in tiny increments with the impossible can opening device on my Swiss Army knife. And then, too lazy to rummage through my pack for my spoon, I scooped them out with the knife itself and ate them hobo style from the blade. So a lot of people ask, did the guy ever write the story on me in the Hobo Times? And I tried to find it, when I was writing the book to see. But the hobos, especially in '95, they weren't online. Like nobody was online, and so they haven't. I mean, the paper exists, but it's not archived. And I sort of think he didn't, just because even though he was so persistent, I think he, got it that I was actually a hiker, not a hobo. He was just having fun. After I read that passage in Boston, I opened it up for questions, which I'm going to do in a little bit. And a lot of times there's that moment when you open it up, people are sort of shy. So I'm always grateful when somebody shoots their hand up. And there was an elderly gentleman in the front row, and he immediately shot his hand up, and I gratefully called on him. And he said, "Have you ever had sex with anyone in exchange for food?" It's either the best or the worst question I've ever received. And I was just, so the whole audience, everyone was just sort of stunned. And because he was in the front row, I had to repeat into the microphone. The gentleman in the front row, I'm just going to use you here, has asked if I've ever had sex with anyone in exchange for food. And there was nothing for me to say but, "No, but would you like to have dinner?" I'll do anything once, but he'd already eaten, so yeah. But I was so hungry on the PCT. Those of you who have read the book know, and anyone in this room who's hiked a long trail or even just gone on a week-long backpacking trip knows that you're out there and the thing you want is food. You just want food. It's pretty amazing what happens. So I was writing Wild. I wrote Wild. What happened is, I get this question a lot, so I'll just answer it for you before you ask it. People say, well, you took the hike in '95 and then, here it was published in 2012. And, the reason for that is a couple of things. One is that it took me, to become a writer is a years-long apprenticeship to the craft. And so I was, I wasn't capable of writing Wild the year or two after I finished my hike. I needed to learn how to be a writer. I also wasn't interested in writing that story. The story that I had burning in me to tell was the story I told in my first book, the novel Torch, that nobody can buy. But you will be able to buy it. It's just being reprinted. And so that, I really spent all those years after my hike really trying to figure out how to be a writer and then writing Torch and writing Torch and writing Torch. And Torch was published in 2006. And when it was published, I had 2 kids under the age of 2. And I took them on my national book tour. Wasn't the glamorous entourage I had imagined in my life when I thought about going on a book tour. I had, you know, 2 little babies. And I was worried, you know, when I finished that tour, like, well, what next? How am I going to, you know, it's going to take me years to write another book. And so by that point, I had published several personal essays in magazines. And I thought, you know, what I'll do is do a collection of essays. And most of them have already been written. And then I'll just write a few original essays for the book. And together, those essays kind of tell the story of my 20s and early 30s. And when I looked at them together, I saw that the whole was, I hadn't written about my hike on the Pacific Crest Trail. Like, I'd mentioned it in a couple essays, like in 1 or 2 sentences, but I'd never written about it. And so I thought that I had about 20 or 30 pages worth of stuff to say about my hike. And I started writing that essay, and that's how Wild was born. I essentially started writing the essay and realized it was this huge story. And so I started it in 2008, and by February 2010, I had finished the first big draft, which is about 30,000 pages, 30,000 words longer than this book. And I sent it off to my editor at Knopf, who'd already purchased the book, having read like the first half. And I was in this wonderful moment in a writer's life when you send a book off and you know the reasonable, rational part of your brain that I very seldom listen to, knows, okay, the editor is going to write me back and there's going to be all these revisions and all this work yet to do. I'm not done. But I had this feeling of this sense of completion, and I thought, well, just maybe I'll be the only writer in the history of writers who gets the editorial letter and just says, perfect, you're brilliant. And so while I was waiting to receive that letter, my friend Steve Almond, who I think actually has come to read here a few times, right? He went to graduate school. Yeah, we love Steve Almond. Emailed me. So I was in this like done with my book mode, and he emailed me and he said, I have been writing a column anonymously called Dear Sugar for a website called The Rumpus, and I've just been doing it intermittently. I'm not, there's no following. I'm not really that interested in it, and it pays nothing. And would you like to take it over? And it's just like, that's my kind of gig, Sign me up. Sign me up. My whole career has been essentially that sort of thing. So, no attention, no acclaim, no pay. So I said, that sounds great, I'll do it. And then I realized, what have I gotten myself into? Because I had not really read advice columns very much. I didn't know how to write. I didn't know how to write one. I didn't have any, real legitimate claim to, be able to give advice. And I did it anyway, and it was because what happened is I really felt a spark in my heart, kind of like that same spark that I felt when I picked up the Pacific Crest Trail Volume 1, California, and I just thought, this is something you have to do. And so I decided to do it. And the deeper, pretty quickly I realized what a great opportunity it was for me as a writer, because real people who are anonymous to me were writing me letters and telling me their secrets and their sorrows and their deepest struggles, and they were sharing their stories with me and asking me to help them figure out what they should do about it. And really, that's essentially what a writer does all the time, in order to really create characters, whether they be non-fictional characters such as in Wild, or the fictional characters that you see in Torch or any other novel or short story collection, you have to really understand human motivation and secrets and deceit and the public face we show and the private lives we live. And so what I thought is I would bring to bear on this column everything I learned as a writer, all my skills as a storyteller. And that I wasn't going to let the form dictate how far I could reach and how big I could make it. And so I decided to really, reach in the direction of, pushing this advice column into the realm of the literary form. And so I did that, and what happened is people started reading it. And I couldn't advertise, I couldn't even say on my Facebook page, hey, I wrote this column, because I was anonymous. It was a secret. And so people just had to find it on their own. And what happened is people started finding it, and they started sharing it on Twitter and Facebook. Maybe some of you are some of those people. Are you? Yes. Are there any sweet peas in the audience? Yes. So That's how sugar was born. And so this book, as you know, and sure enough, the letter came from my editor, and it did not say, "It's perfect, you're brilliant." It said all the things that she suggested I revise. And so as I was revising Wild and putting the finishing touches on this book, I was writing Tiny Beautiful Things, not knowing I was writing the book. I was writing these columns week by week. And pretty soon enough people just said, "Will you please collect these together?" Then I took it to my publisher and said, "How about we do this?" And so that's how it came to be born. And I'm just going to read, I think, I thought I'd read the first column I ever wrote as Sugar. And I should say, those of you who are familiar with Steve Almond know that he's incredibly funny. And contrary to all the laughter and that hobo scene we just had, I tend not to be so funny. I tend to be a little more likely to make you bald your head off. But so my first, and that's to come, people. You will be crying by the end of the night, don't worry. But so this very first column, you know, how I learned how to write is by imitating writers I loved. And so my first impulse for the Dear Sugar column was just to imitate the hell out of Steve Almond, so I would not be publicly humiliated. So I tried to be funny. So this is my attempt, my grim attempt. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it when I finish reading it. It's called The Known Unknowns. It's the first, when I took over for Steve, he had 4 letters to hand off to me. I now have thousands of letters, but there were those 4 letters, and this was the first one I chose to answer. Can everyone still hear me? Yeah. Dear Sugar, I dated this girl for a while, only to reach the realization that she was a self-absorbed crazy. Last year, she and her best friend got into an argument and they stopped being friends. My ex's friend called me up one night and asked me to hang out with her at her house. One thing led to another, and I ended up sleeping with her. A few days later, this former best friend of my ex tells me she's engaged. She wears this weird, short-haired wig while she breaks off our friends with benefits relationship. The thing is, I connected better with her in the 2 weeks we hung out than I did with my ex in months. Please help me figure out if I should never talk to either one of them again. I'm not a smart man, but I do know what love is. Gump. Dear Gump, I'd rather be sodomized by a plastic lawn flamingo than vote for a Republican. But as I consider your situation, I can't help but quote the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who quite wisely said, "There are known knowns, there are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know we don't know." Unquote. Okay, that was all Rumsfeld there. Shall we start with the known knowns when it comes to your little triangular quagmire, Gump? A, you found your ex-girlfriend to be crazy and broke up with her. B, you fucked your ex-girlfriend's ex-best friend for a fortnight and felt connected. C, in spite of such connection, your ex-girlfriend's ex-best friend donned a wig and announced that she has no interest in continuing to sleep with you, claiming to be on the brink of a presumably monogamous and eternal connection to someone else. Which brings us to the known unknowns. A, why the wig? And if the wig, why the unnervingly short hair? B, is the ex-girlfriend's ex-best friend actually engaged to be married? Or is this simply a grandiose ruse to shake you from her disinterested but chicken shit tale? C, how can it be that so many people's ex-girlfriends are crazy? What happens to these women? Do they eventually go on to birth babies and care for their elderly parents and scramble up gigantic pans of eggs on Sunday mornings for oodles of loungeabouts who later have the nerve to inquire about what's for dinner? Or is there some corporate rest home for crazy bitches in cities across the land that I am unaware of, that houses all these women who used to love men, who later claimed they were actually crazy bitches? Lastly, there are the unknown unknowns, the things, Gump, you don't know you don't know. A, you have nothing for these women. B, these women have nothing for you. C, and yet. D, and yet. E, you are loved. Sugar. What's interesting to me looking back, once I really made the sugar column what it's become, is when I went back, it wasn't until, maybe a year or so after I wrote that I went back and read it. And I saw that where I landed in that last line, you are loved, is exactly where I took the sugar column. Those of you who've read it know that essentially, the thing I really give to readers is this feeling of unconditional positive regard. There's a great amount of a kind of non-hokey love that goes on in the column, and I was really going to push hard in that direction. And I didn't quite know that I was going to. It was again, just like the way Wild was born, out of just my own kind of curiosity and writing into it. That's what happened with Sugar. And what happened too, I thought that I would be writing to 20-something and 30-something kind of hipsters. The Rumpus is based in San Francisco, and that's kind of their audience. But what happened is people of all ages and both genders really started reading the column, and it became, I always wanted to make the column as diverse as possible. It wasn't just going to be about romance and sex and relationships. It was going to be about grief and loss and work and money and everything really that we go through in life at all different stages. And so, there are letters in Tiny Beautiful Things from 65-year-old guys who are looking for love. And there are letters from people whose children have brain tumors or been killed by drunk drivers, and what do they do with their grief. And there are all kinds of letters at all different stages. I'm going to just read you the title column called Tiny Beautiful Things. And it's the last column in the book. And it's a little bit different than all the rest, because I'm really giving myself advice in it. I should say one of the hallmarks of the Sugar column too is that I started to realize that to tell stories from my own life was often the most powerful way for me to not just give advice, but actually illuminate the human condition. And so I used, again, I've in some ways Tiny Beautiful Things is like a jigsaw puzzle of a memoir. And in fact, there are 2 or 3 things in here that were originally in Wild, that in the course of the revision, I took them out of Wild and realized that they were needed in a Sugar column instead. So here is Tiny Beautiful Things, and then I'll open it up for questions. So, Dear Sugar, I read your column religiously. I'm 22. From what I can tell by your writing, you're in your early 40s. My question is short and sweet. What would you tell your 20-something self if you could talk to her now? Love Seeking Wisdom. Dear Seeking Wisdom, stop worrying about whether you're fat. You're not fat. Or rather, you're sometimes a little bit fat, but who gives a shit? There is nothing more boring and fruitless than a woman lamenting the fact that her stomach is round. Feed yourself, literally. The sort of people worthy of your love will love you more for this, sweet pea. In the middle of the night, in the middle of your 20s, when your best woman friend crawls naked into your bed, straddles you, and says, you should run away from me before I devour you. Believe her. So you guys have had that friend too. You are not a terrible person for wanting to break up with someone you love. You don't need a reason to leave. Wanting to leave is enough. Leaving doesn't mean you're incapable of real love or that you'll never love anyone else again. It doesn't mean you're morally bankrupt or psychologically demented or a nymphomaniac. It means you wish to change the terms of one particular relationship. That's all. Be brave enough to break your own heart. When that really sweet but fucked up gay couple invites you over to their cool apartment to do ecstasy with them, say no. There are some things you can't understand yet. Your life will be a great and continuous unfolding. It's good you've worked hard to resolve childhood issues while in your 20s, but understand that what you resolve will need to be resolved again and again. You will come to know things that can only be known with the wisdom of age and the grace of years. Most of those things will have to do with forgiveness. One evening, you will be rolling around on the wooden floor of your apartment with a man who will tell you he doesn't have a condom. You will smile in a spunky way that you think is hot and tell him to do it anyway. This will be a mistake for which you alone will pay. Don't lament so much about how your career is going to turn out. You don't have a career. You have a life. Do the work. Keep the faith. Be true blue. You are a writer because you write. Keep writing and quit your bitching. Your book has a birthday. You don't know what it is yet. You cannot convince people to love you. This is an absolute rule. No one will ever give you love because you want him or her to give it. Real love moves freely in both directions. Don't waste your time on anything else. Most things will be okay eventually, but not everything will be. Sometimes you'll put up a good fight and lose. Sometimes you'll hold on really hard and realize there is no choice but to let go. Acceptance is a small, quiet room. One hot afternoon during the era in which you've gotten yourself ridiculously tangled up with heroin, you will be riding the bus and thinking what a worthless piece of crap you are, when a little girl will get on the bus holding the strings of 2 purple balloons. She'll offer you one of the balloons, but you won't take it because you believe you no longer have the right to such tiny, beautiful things. You're wrong. You do. Your assumptions about the lives of others are in direct relation to your naive pomposity. Many people you believe to be rich are not rich. Many people you think have it easy, worked hard for what they got. Many people who seem to be gliding right along have suffered and are suffering. Many people who appear to you to be old and stupidly saddled down with kids and cars and houses were once every bit as hip and pompous as you. When you meet a man in the doorway of a Mexican restaurant who later kisses you while explaining that this kiss doesn't mean anything, because much as he likes you, he's not interested in having a relationship with you or anyone right now, just laugh and kiss him back. Your daughter will have his sense of humor. Your son will have his eyes. And I should say here, it's our 13th wedding anniversary. Me and that guy who was like, well, you know, don't go loving me, babe. But the useless days will add up to something. The shitty waitressing jobs, the hours writing in your journal, the long meandering walks, the reading poetry and story collections and novels and dead people's diaries and wondering about sex and God and whether you should shave under your arms or not. These things are your becoming. One Christmas, at the very beginning of your 20s, when your mother gives you a warm coat that she saved for months to buy, don't look at her skeptically after she tells you she thought the coat was perfect for you. Don't hold it up and say it's longer than you like your coats to be, or too puffy, and possibly even too warm. Your mother will be dead by spring. That coat will be the last gift she gave you. You will regret the small thing you didn't say for the rest of your life. Say thank you, sugar. for me? Okay, yes, there.
When you write something that powerful, does it come out the first time, or is that something that you work at?
So the question is, when I write something that powerful, does it come out the first time, or is it something I work at? And the answer is twofold. I mean, I think, you know, when I said earlier, you know, it took me years to become a writer. You know, it's like anything. You know, like those Olympians we're watching. You know, they go on and they do that thing for sometimes 10 seconds, and you know, it's years of training to do that. And I think that that's certainly the truth in my case. You know, I've been a very serious writer since I was 19. I'm 43 now, and so it's a muscle I've worked for a long time. I've studied really hard and written a lot that didn't make it, you know. And so I think that sometimes stuff does come out pretty quickly. Like that piece I just read you, Tiny Beautiful Things. I wrote it, most of the sugar columns, strangely, they defied all rules for me. I wrote most of them in the middle of the night because I would be up against the deadline, and I would just write that. I would stay up all night Wednesday night and write those columns. And Tiny Beautiful Things, I wrote it in a hotel room in Washington, D.C. I was at a conference, and I came down with a flu, and I had a high fever, and I was just sitting in my room, and I wrote it. And I wrote that, you know, in like a day or so. Now, of course, I went back and revised, and, you know, over the next week or so, but pretty quickly I wrote that. And same with Wild, like a lot of those scenes, you know, I wrote them over and over again over a number of days. So, you know, revision is a really big part of the process, you know. But then there also is just the years of training that you can draw on to create that sort of stuff. Yeah, yes?
Hi.
Hi.
Let's see, I love that response that you gave to the woman. I can't remember what it was about either, but you said, you know, something about God not being the grantor of wishes, that he was what, a mother effing bitch or something like that. I love that.
In Sugar or Wild? Yeah.
I read them both
Yeah.
last week, so
well, I say, right, well, because, right, when my mom got sick, suddenly I was like trying to pray to God, and found that I had that very childlike view, I guess, of God, that God would be somebody to swoop down and save us, you know, in our moment of need. And obviously, anyone who really has a relationship with God understands God in a much more complex way than that. But yeah, at that moment when I was, you know, realizing my mom was going to die, I was reaching for anything that would save me. And I realized that God wasn't going to. Yeah. I'm sorry, I hijacked your question. Do you have a question about that?
well, that was it.
Mhm.
And the question is, the second part of that is like, now that God is the grantor of your wishes, about your book,
Yeah.
you know, is it different? Or?
So that's an interesting. So now, the question is like, now that God has granted my wishes about my book, you know, it's so interesting, and I know this is going to sound kind of hard to believe, but it's true. So I'll just tell you the truth. That I'm just really, really, really amazed and grateful for all the success that Wild has had, and Tiny Beautiful Things too. But I've been a writer so long that I really, you know, learned that the place I had to put my wishes and my dreams was in my ability to write work that I felt in my own heart was the best work that I could possibly do. And, you know, when I think about the most, I guess, sacred days, if you will, of both Tiny Beautiful Things and Wild, and Torch too, it's that day that I finished the book, and that I knew I'd really worked really hard and given it everything I had. And so then what happens is, then you don't put your faith in the marketplace. Because we all know, I mean, I know a lot of really, really great writers who will never be on the bestseller list, you know, and that doesn't mean that they're not a great writer. That is not the measure of success in the arts. Some really great things are rewarded, and some really great things are not. And so I try really hard to detach, I guess, my own feeling of achievement from that external stuff. I'm really grateful for it, don't get me wrong. So I didn't pray for that. It wasn't on my vision board.
It wasn't.
I don't even know what a vision board was. Ever since Oprah called me, everyone's like, did you put that on your vision board? And then I realized that a vision board is a thing. Do you guys know what a vision board is? Yeah, so what I put on my vision board was, like, inside my head, write that best book I can write, you know, so, yeah. Back there.
I read Wild and I loved it.
Thank you.
And I have, I've seen it also help a lot of personal friends and I'm from Portland, Oregon, by the way.
Hi.
Tragedies in their own life. And it's so brutally honest, and the characters are obviously real. And I was wondering what was the reaction of the people in the book that you wrote about, like that have gone through what you had gone through? So your brother and your sister and your ex-husband.
Did everyone hear that?
Yeah.
Writing about other people is the most terrifying part of writing a memoir, trust me. Because, you know, you need to strike that balance. Obviously, I had to tell, I mean, the story's about me, so at least I could keep the focus on me, but inevitably, the people in my life get written about, like my poor ex-husband. But, you know, he loves the book, and he wrote me the world's nicest email in response to the book. My brother, same story. He read it and was just deeply moved by it, and it was hard for him. It was harrowing for him, frankly, to read the book. And we had the most profound conversation of our whole lives, in response to the book. I think so often people think writing about your family, like writing a memoir is going to divide you from people, but actually it's really brought me together with a lot of people. My stepfather as well. I mean, we have not seen each other for years or communicated, and he came to a reading of mine in Duluth, Minnesota, and he came and hugged me and told me he loved me, and so that was lovely, you know, and so no, nothing bad has happened to me yet. Yes.
This is a memoir, and you have a lot of details in Wild, and I'm interested in the mechanics of remembering so many detailed your feelings, your interactions with other people along the way. Did you have any mindset while you were on the trail that I should take notes, or were you really just have a great sense of memory?
I journaled. So the question is about memoir and how do you write, when you are writing a memoir, how do you reconjure all those details? So and a few different things. One, I kept a journal, and you know, I did mention that in Wild, but I think only about a quarter of the people who read Wild sort of picked up on that. I didn't want to keep repeating, like, I wrote in my journal, but now I wish I'd written that like a couple more times, because I keep getting that question. I wasn't taking notes to write a book, but I was taking notes because I journaled avidly all through my 20s and 30s, basically until the moment my kids were born, and then the journal just, you know, went out the window. But no more sitting around in cafes wearing, you know, raspberry berets and writing my journal. But I wrote in my journal, you know, so I had that to draw on a lot when writing Wild, and it was so helpful. So things like the contents of the hobo care package, you know, were in my journal. I would have remembered a lot of it. So there's that. I sometimes track down people who I met, you know, on the hike and ask them what they remembered of our time together. I fact-checked. The most embarrassing fact-check was, those of you who've read the book know that there are these three young guys called the Three Young Bucks. And they're just these, you know, cute guys who I met and sort of hiked with a little bit. And they were Richie, Josh, and Rick. Those are their real names. And Rick and I, you know, really had quite a crush on each other. And I was writing this scene about just how much I liked him, and we're lying like right next to each other in this back of this pickup, just pressed against each other, and we don't kiss, but I really want to, and I'm not writing about how like I can tell he wants to and all this stuff. But so I'm writing that scene, and what happened, the story beyond that with me and Rick is that, you know, we became friends, and we are still friends, and he was at my wedding 13 years ago today, and we moved on in life without ever talking about that crush. And so when I was writing Wild, I thought, oh my God, what if I'm wrong? Like, what if, because, you know, I'm right, it is from my perspective, you know? And what if, like, total miscues? And then he reads that, and he's like, Cheryl, no offense, but it wasn't happening for me, you know? So I'm like, the only way to do this is just to come out with it. And so I emailed him and said, Rick, you know, this is kind of embarrassing, but did you have a crush on me in '95? And he's like, oh my God, Cheryl. You know, so we had this, He's like, I was in love with you. Why didn't you kiss me? You know, you were the older one. You were supposed to kiss me, he said. And so we had this long, these long emails back and forth, and we're play by play, like all of these moments, and what he was thinking and what I was thinking, and my husband was like, well, that's great for you guys. And so I fact-checked that, so that is fact. And then Richie, who's one of the other 3 young bucks, he's from New Orleans, and he's a super cool guy. And when I met him, I knew he was one of the most original people I've ever met. And I didn't write a ton about him in Wild because it would have just taken the story off the beaten, but he's just so cool. And what he would do, there's a picture, I think, on my website and on Oprah's site too, there's a picture of a man who's wearing like this necklace and he's holding a rattlesnake. So that's Richie K. And what he did is whenever they would encounter a rattlesnake when they were hiking, he would pick it up, a wild rattlesnake. He's really interesting. So he wrote me a letter. He doesn't have email. He wrote me an old-fashioned letter that I just got a week or 2 ago. And he said, Cheryl, I just want to thank you for, writing so accurately, about us and about our meeting. And he said, in particular, just that we were such handsome studs. He's like, that's exactly how I remember it, too. So, I got that part right. But the other thing I will say about memory, so the art of memoir, it's my subjective, these things happened, and it's also how I interpreted what they happened and how I remember it. And, it's kind of like that writer's muscle. Memory is also a muscle that, you really, when you are mining memory, what happens is you remember more as you work. And so it's the best thing I can liken it to is when you run into an old friend and you get to talking about old times and they help you remember things you thought you forgot. And you're like, oh yeah, I do remember that. And so that's how writing it is. And also you need to just, in order to create that vivid picture for you guys, I just need to commit to my memory of it. So if I picture the hobo reporter, his hair blowing that way, or the way his skin looked, or his pants looked, or whatever, if I picture that, I'm going to give it to you with authority and confidence. I'm not going to say, I think he was wearing corduroys, and I think the wind blew, and I think, So you have to, and that's the sort of magic of memoir. It's got one foot in the world of journalism and the other foot in the world of the grandmother sitting on the rocking porch spinning you a yarn, And so it's those sorts of things that you do in memoir. So maybe a couple more questions back. Anybody else? Sorry.
I'm going to ask about the difference between writing Dear Sugar and writing Wild at the same time. One, you sort of have an audience, an actual person that's written to you, and one, you're sort of writing anonymously, I guess, to an unknown audience. Does that make a difference when you approach the page or when you're working?
It did. So the question's about the difference in writing Dear Sugar and Wild, and it's a subtle but significant shift. And so in Wild, I'm writing, but I'm pretending that you guys aren't there. There's this sort of screen. It's like I'm telling the story. I'm never directly addressing you and saying you. In Sugar, I'm directly addressing the letter writer, but I know you guys are all listening. So it's like giving therapy in the town square. So there's the direct address versus the sort of, the magic of literature, where you just sort of, there's that screen. And so I did find it was just slightly tonally different. And I also told stories from my own life for a different reason. When I was telling you stories about my life in Wild, when I would tell those flashback stories from my childhood or whatnot, it would be to illuminate for you, I guess, my character or my experience, in hopes that you would recognize the universal human experience or recognize yourselves. And in Sugar, I use my stories from my life to help that letter writer illuminate his or her experience. And so it's just a slight shift, but so it was great because I'd done the major heavy lifting for Wild before I began Sugar, and so Sugar was kind of like this new thing I got to explore as a writer. So yeah, maybe 1 or 2 questions. Yes.
I'm curious to know why you didn't quit after those first 8 days. I've done backpacking myself, and I have quit, and I know how easy that is. And also, what do you think it is about the Wild that draws people to find themselves there, to discover whatever it is in their life they need to work through?
Right. So why didn't I quit after those first 8 days, or the first 10 minutes? I could not quit. Like, I absolutely could not fail at this. There was, you know, I think when you reach for something in the bottom of your life, it's a do or die situation. And I had to do this thing. Plus, I'm a proud person. You know, everyone, I mean, I got rid of everything. I sold things, I packed, I announced what I was doing. All my friends were like, you're crazy, you know, you can't do this. And so I needed to also just do it. I said I would do it. And I do tend to be somebody who is very determined, and when I say I'm gonna do something, I do it. And so I just pulled that up in me. And the second question was the wild, what was the, sorry?
Why do you think the wild was where you needed to go?
Why do I think the wild was where I need to go? Well, you know, I think it's the place we all need to go. You know, I think that we all know the answer to that question instinctually. When we go to the wild, when we go to those quiet, wild, I mean, they're not always quiet. Sometimes there's a lot of noise in the wild, but those places where we can, I guess, you know, connect with truly how small we are in the universe, in the scheme of things. When we can see that forest or that river or that mountain range or that desert and feel ourselves both a part of that magnificence and a really insignificant piece. And I think that we forget that, and we're all busy and, you know, doing this and that, and we forget that, you know, what really is our essence, like where we are and who we come from and what our purpose is in life. And I had grown up in the North Woods of Minnesota, off the grid, in the wilderness, without running water or electricity or indoor plumbing. I knew that that was a place that I felt gathered, so I went there when I needed to go. So I think I should just maybe take one last question and then we can sign books. Yes, yes. Somebody's raising 2 hands. I mean, how about both of you? Okay, there and then there.
Okay. You get, okay. I was gonna ask a different question, but then someone over there asked about how now you're having a lot of success as a writer and all this, you know, your book is finally out. And I was wondering how is what you thought of being a successful writer changed from when you first started to today?
How has what I thought about being a successful?
What were you like?
I think that a lot of times whenever any of us think about that thing that, you know, when you meet the person you marry, or when you have the success you always dreamed of, or any of those things, we always have the idealized vision of what that's actually going to feel like on a daily basis. And then you get there and you realize, well, it's still, you're still you. I'm still, you know, quite honestly, the main thing that has changed in my life is that I'm incredibly busy, and I am incredibly torn about how much I'm away from my husband and kids, and it's hard, you know, and I'm grateful for it, but that's what it feels like on the ground level. Now, once in a while, I'll step back and I'll think, this is amazing, and I'm so, you know, obviously thrilled. But I guess the difference between that is that like idealized version versus the, you know, the fact that I'm still just me, and I still have to write that next book that will probably disappoint you guys, and, you know, probably be like, I can already write the review now, you know, like comparing it to Wild, and then like how, you know, it's such a letdown, and you know, it's like, I know that's coming, yeah? But you know, I mean, so I think what I mean is you're still you. In that. Okay, the 2-hand waiver.
Okay. So I could really relate to the children, because I did that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the PCT business, the Himalayas.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and so what I really appreciated more than anything was your description of your feet. Because that is the hard knocks of a hiker.
Yeah.
And a hiker with too much weight, and you were willing to be real about that in the book. And I have a great appreciation. And how are your feet?
Yeah, how are my feet is the #1 question I get on the book tour, for sure. And they're fine now, but it took a couple of years for them to be fine.
You write a lot about it.
I do, and a lot of people who aren't backpackers will say, oh my God, you know, like they think that what happened to my feet is unique. And it's not. I mean, like I'm not saying every backpacker struggles with their feet as much as I did. But, you know, a certain percentage. I mean, I would say maybe, I'm just going to say probably 1 out of 4 through hikers have serious problem with their feet along the trail. And many of them quit because of it, you know, because it's a big deal. So My feet have now been restored to their original beauty, or at least as close to a 43-year-old could get to that. And it did take a few years for those toenails to grow back, but they did.
Thank you for the story.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight.